Welcome to the BuiltOnAir podcast, the variety show for all things Airtable. In each episode, we cover 4 different segments. It's always fresh and different, and lots of fun while you get the insider info on all things Airtable. Our hosts and guests are some of the most senior experts in the Airtable community. Join us live each week on our YouTube channel every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, and join our active community at BuiltOnAir.com. Before we begin, a word from our sponsor, On2Air Backups. On2Air Backups provides automated Airtable backups to your cloud storage for secure and reliable data protection. Prevent data loss and set up a secure Airtable backup system with On2Air Backups at On2Air.com. As one customer, Sarah, said, having automated Airtable backups has freed up hours of my time every other week and the fear of losing anything. Longtime customer David states, On2Air Backups might be the most critical piece of the puzzle to guard against unforeseeable disaster. It's easy to set up, and it just works. Join Sarah, David, and hundreds more Airtable users like you to protect your Airtable data with On2Air Backups. Sign up today with promo code BuiltOnAir for a 10% discount. Check them out at On2Air.com. And now let's check out today's episode and see what we built on air.
Welcome back to the Built on Air podcast. We are in season 23, episode 2. And as I mentioned last week, we're kind of changing our format. We're going to just kind of be here. We don't have any slides or anything to kick us off or anything. But last week we went through, got you up to date on everything in the world of Airtable. And this week we're going to do a deep dive and spend some time really learning the ins and outs of Airtable with the use case. And so, yeah, I don't think there is any big news, anything worth mentioning. Relatively quiet week.
Yeah, nothing new. Yeah, I think all of the good stuff happened while we were gone. And now it's kind of like a little bit back to basics.
Digesting everything. So cool. With that, so Kamille is going to walk us through a demo and talk us through it. And we're going to go deep into this. So I'll share your screen on here and go for it.
All right. So this kind of use case came to me just as a like, oh, I wonder if I could do this without a script. It's come up a couple of times in the forums and a couple other places where people have the need for records that are based on some sort of date to repeat over a specific interval. And that interval can be simple, like do this every Monday, or it could be a little bit more complex of do this every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or at the end of every month, etc. And I think I had done this previously in the past with a script. And yeah, I was just really curious what I could do if I said, nope, we're going to do it all in formulas and as few automations as possible. So with that, what we're currently looking at is a very simple interface I threw together. And the example use case I came up with was a habit tracker. So I used to have an app on my phone that was, supposed to keep you honest on the stuff that you're supposed to do frequently. And I put together a list of chores and then set them on a schedule. So I'm a millennial, so all of the mail that I get is just junk mail. So I really only check my mail like at the end of the month, to be honest. So if I expand my settings section, I have it set up where each one of these records can have a repeating schedule attached to it. This is kind of where I miss the ability to hide, have conditional visibility on interface sections. Not every one of these sections, settings over to the right are relevant for all of these, but just to read out some of the ones that I've already baked in here at a set interval would let me do the first 2. So I could do any number of days, weeks, months. I could have expanded to quarters and years, but didn't think that was necessary for this demo. On specific weekdays would be just this one here. where I'm linking to Sunday, Monday, Tuesday through Saturday. And I'll talk about why that is a linked record field instead of a multi-select field as we sort of get deeper into the how I set all of this up. And then the last two, fairly straightforward, on the first day of the month or on the last day of the month. And with this example, it's set to on the last day of the month. I also added in the ability to have habit streaks. So if you do your chores or whatever these records are called, every record in a row, you add on to a streak. But if you miss one, it starts a new streak. And then if I scroll down to the calendar, you can see that the fourth time that this chore was supposed to happen was at the end of last month, which is December 2025. And then the next one coming up is January 31st. And if I scroll back, these are color coded. So green means I did it when I was supposed to, and light green means I did it, but late. And I think gray means that it just hasn't happened yet. So that's my way of visually taking track of those streaks. And the last thing that's on this interface is this automatic button here. If I scroll, you'll see that my records sort of stop in January, and then I don't have any more after that. There's none for the end of February. If I click this button, it's going to run an automation that's going to create all of the next set of chores. And it does it. I stopped at 5, and you'll see why I stopped at 5 when we get to the automation that controls this. So it goes all the way to the 10th, which would put us in June, and I can keep clicking this and it would create the next 5, always popping on when the date should actually be. So you can see it's still going and then it's done. So that is the general setup of what this looks like, and it works the same. Let me go back to today for the more complicated ones, like do this on specific weekdays. Like I said, there's some good reasoning as to why this is a linked record field instead of a multi-select field, mostly because I wanted to be able to handle, I've conveniently linked Monday, Wednesday, Friday in the order in which they appear in a week. But what if I didn't link these in the actual order? So if I did Sunday and then Tuesday, I wanted the formula behind the scenes to be able to account for, yes, you put in all the days, but you didn't like put them in the right order. That's easier to do with a linked record field. If I scroll down, it's going to take into account whatever you had selected at the time, and it's going to count going forward. So Monday already happened in this week, so it started with the next day in the cycle, which would have been tomorrow, which is a Wednesday, and then Friday, and then the next week, there is a Monday that's eligible. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if I run this again, the next time it goes, it's going to do Sunday and Tuesday as well. And then the more simple example is on a set interval, repeat every 3 days. So those are all of the different configurations that I've set up. And now we can kind of talk about my way of doing this. Now, you could do this in a considerably different manner than I did this, but I wanted to make this hopefully easy to understand. And then I gave up after a while because I think it's easy to understand, but you really have to look at it for a while. At least that's my interpretation of it. So to start with, you start with the question that you want to ask. How often does this thing repeat? And so the first thing I had to grapple with is, what are the scenarios that I even wanted to cover? There's several other types of repetition that are not in this space, but could be, like do this on every third Thursday, for example. That's not something that the space can do quite yet, but it's something that I could add. And then we need things to repeat. So I'm linking to another table called tasks, which is just pretty simple. It's a link of what the chore is or the habit, and then a number to indicate this is the first time, the second time, the third time when it's due. We'll talk about streaks later. and then a simple status of yes, it was done, or no, it hasn't been done yet. And then from there, now we need specific information about that repetition. So if you chose a set interval, I need to know a number of times to like skip. So this is what this field is, the repeat interval number, simple number field, nothing special. And then repeat interval period, simple single select field. Like I said before, you could do hours if you wanted. You could do quarters or years. I stuck with days, weeks, and months. The process is going to be the same no matter what you pick. And then for that, I'm going to kind of scroll to the right and you can kind of preview. It takes a couple of different formulas for this to work in the way that I wanted it to work. And it all kind of culminates in this one field called next due date. In order to do this and keep it clean, I have the simple, like overarching formula here of depending on what your when to repeat is, your schedule, it will output the date of some of these more complicated, more specific formulas. That way, this formula remains pretty legible. So at a set interval, we want to take the last due date and add this number of periods. So the date add field is pretty great in that all it needs is a starting date, a number, and whether it's days, weeks, months. And that's why I formatted those other two fields in that way. So the date add portion of it could be pretty straightforward. You just plug in those days. The other ones needed a little bit more help. So they are all based off of the latest due date, which is taking all of the records from the task table that are linked to that habit or chore. And they're trying to find, well, what is the latest due date? And if there isn't one, this is just a roll-up field with max as the aggregation. If there isn't one, just use today. So we don't have any errors in any of our date calculation. We need to give it something. The most complicated interval to go over is on specific weekdays. This one took the majority of my time to figure out. Like I said before, it's based off of a table of weekdays. Also, I could have a sort or a number field associated with each of them. And that allows me to more easily add or subtract days depending on when we need to offset. So if I scroll, it takes several formulas to get to where I need to go. Starting with latest weekday, we take the latest due date, which is the one that we just went over, and we format it as a day or as a weekday. So starts pretty simple, one date time format. And again, this is why we output today. If we don't have any tasks yet. It's so that all the remaining formulas don't need that if clause of if date, then calculate, if not, leave empty. This just lets all of the remaining formulas, and there's a couple, be as simple as they can be. So now we need to know what is the position of the latest weekday. And when we say position, we're talking about this formula. This is the most hacky portion, I think, of my implementation that I've done. It's all of the weekdays in the 3-letter format and then repeated twice. The reason being is because if you have something repeat, say Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, it was very difficult for me to write a formula that says, well, if today is Saturday, the next thing in the sequence should be Monday. And if I stopped the sequence at Saturday, there would be nothing left in the sequence. So if I repeat it twice, if today is Saturday, it can keep going and say it's Monday. You don't need to keep repeating it infinitely, because if you're using the find function in a formula, it's going to find the first time Saturday appears. So we're actually never going to get to the second Saturday. We're always going to start here. And then it's able to skip forward and say, oh, the next thing in the sequence is Monday. So is there another way to do that? Probably. This is the way I did it. So that's the position of where, in this case, Friday is in this very long string of every weekday repeated twice. Now we need to know when the next weekday is in the sequence. So this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated. So what we need to do is take, if the current or the latest weekday in the sequence of all the tasks that we have is Friday, we need to know what the next one in the sequence is. If you've only set one day that it repeats on, it repeats every Friday, well, then you can just say, all right, well, then the next weekday is whatever the latest weekday is. That's this first condition. Kind of gets you out of doing all of this complicated logic. And then, like I said before, I did this where Sunday is the start of the week. If you want to replicate this where Monday is the start of the week, you would adjust what your special day is. For me, my special day is Saturday, which is the end of the week. If the latest weekday is Saturday, then you know that the next weekday is whatever the first day in the sequence is. That's what this is, because the week is over. It's going to be whatever the next day is. And then all of the other ones are a calculation of find today, or what the latest weekday is in the sequence, and then find what the next one is, and then calculate the distance between them. The reason why the number 3 is all over the place and then it increments 3, 6, 9, 12 is because of the way I formatted all of the names of the days. Sun is 3 characters long. That's why 3 was all over that formula. All of that gives me enough information to calculate what the next weekday is. So I can plug it into the overall formula of, on specific weekdays, I now know how many days to add to my latest due date, and it's always going to be adding days. The next two, much more straightforward. First day of the month and last day of the month.
Before, go back to the long formula, not the switch, but this one.
Well, no.
Or no.
This one.
This way. Okay. So what? So when you get a formula like this, where there's lots of stuff going on, like what? How do you debug this? How do you get this working? What are some tips and tricks to get a complex formula like this?
Yeah. So originally I came up with a formula that worked in the test scenario that I came up with. And then I kept testing and realized it didn't work at all if the last day was Saturday. So I had to add extra stuff at the top. So really what helped with writing this was coming up with a couple of different scenarios I wanted to test for. I wanted to test how simple could the formula be if you know you were repeating on one weekday? Right. Then you don't need all of this complicated logic about the sequence or anything. If it's the same weekday, then it's just add 7 days to whatever the last one is. And then I had to figure out what to do Saturday. And then I realized, well, if I order all of the weekdays 1 through 7, and I know that Saturday is the last one, then what if I have my weekdays in the sequence, the next one is going to be whatever the first one is. So that's how I came up with like this workaround. And then this was all about repetition. Well, this is kind of long. This is the same formula over and over and over again, where the only difference is where you start from. 3, 6, 9, 12, etc. So I really had to think through. I try to put it in words of what I was trying to do. And what I was trying to do was, I know that the latest weekday is this field, and I wanted to find where's the first time this word appears in this sequence. And then I know the next thing I'm looking for based on the weekdays that I'm repeating. So I want to get from here to where the next word appears in that sequence. So talking it out kind of helped me figure out what I needed to write. And then it was just a lot of tweaking, at least for me, of like now that I have it in words that at least I understand, I need to find a way to make it repeatable so that if I need to change this going forward, I might have to make several changes, but they're predictable changes. So in this case, right, if I wanted to move from weeks start on Sunday to weeks start on Monday, all of the numbers can remain the same, but I'd have to change Saturday to Sunday instead, because that would be when the weeks end now.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that I like started to think through. And the reason why I have multiple formulas, you could, in theory, have done this all in one big formula, but then it would have been really, really, really hard to read. So I took it where each of my repetition intervals had their own set of formulas if they needed them. That way, if I wanted to tweak how first day of the month worked, for example, I can go to just the formula that controls that one and not have to like dig through a very long formula that controls all of them.
Allie, any other tips or tricks with debugging complex formulas?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, I typically duplicate the field, especially if it's a formula that's like already being used and has dependencies. So always duplicate it first. And then the first thing I do is I put a little test tube emoji in front of the field name so that when I'm looking at it, I know which one's my test one and which one is the real one. But breaking it out into several different formulas, like Kamille was just touching on, is my number one tip, I think, for debugging formulas. And if you're having trouble, it's like you might not know if you've got a lot of nested pieces of that function, you really need to know like which part of it is throwing off the rest. Yep. So breaking it out into its smallest components and kind of working from there is, in my opinion, the best and easiest way to debug.
I also had a couple of like temporary formula fields. Like when I was doing, not this one, at the beginning, the first version of this formula, it was take this and then do this and then do this and then do that. And it wasn't coming up with what I wanted. So I had a separate formula field where I would test each of those thises, where I found what the output of just this part of the formula was. And that helped me figure out, oh, okay, well, the first 3 steps of this formula are doing what they're supposed to, but the 4th step, I did something wrong there. It's outputting, it's not outputting a string, it's outputting a number. So I need to figure out what I can do to just this part to get it back into the format that I'm expecting so that steps 5, 6, etc. can work the way that they need to. So having those temporary separate formulas help you do that debugging as well. And once you've figured it out, you can get rid of them and they're out of the way. Similar to Allie about adding a specific emoji to the start, you'll notice that some of my formulas have this sort of white dot and some of them have this gear icon in front of them. That's more kind of like naming convention to help me understand the difference between a lot of these fields that are going to have similar names because they're like helper fields for another field, if that makes sense. So in this instance, all of the gear icons are like, this is a setting that should be displayed to the user. So we want people to go back and edit how many days are in between the repetitions or what weekdays, so they get the gear icon. And then the white dots are more like, well, these are all helper fields that you don't really need to look at. Once you've written out all of these formulas, you don't need to look at them again until you want to change something foundationally about the date calculation. And then the last field that is actually used for creating these new records, it doesn't have any emoji at the start. It's a simple formula that outputs the desired end result. And then
One thing I started doing with switch statements, and if you're not familiar with a switch statement, it's essentially like a big if else, if and you set it to the first value, and then it's kind of a weird one because it's like the first one is what you're basically looking on, and then you're comparing that with the second and then third. So it's like every other entry is a comparison on the first entry.
Yeah.
Anyways, one thing I started doing with something like this is using linked records for the values instead of a drop down, and then using the record IDs. So that, because my biggest fear, especially in formula, is if you're comparing any field with a value of a drop down, that somebody's going to change the value of that drop down.
Yep.
And then it messes up all your formulas.
I sometimes will use emojis in like those drop down values. So like if it's like, say to do, in progress, done, I might have like an X, a hourglass.
So as long as they don't change the
exactly. And I tell them like, you can change what the words are, but don't change the emoji, or like something like that, just so it's
but then it wouldn't work in a switch. The switch has to be the full value.
Well, you could change the first part to say like left one of the thing, so it's whatever the first character is, and make that. But yeah, both of those great solutions for the switch, because I'm terrible at spelling, apparently. So it is often the case where like the logic is fine, and then it will output nothing, or whatever the default is. And then I'll look back and it's like, oh, I added 2 N's to the word month for whatever reason in the drop down. And so you have to go back and rename it and make sure that your formula, which is dependent on it, they have to match spelling. So another thing with the switch as well, sometimes it's helpful to wrap whatever you're sending in as lower, so that you don't have to worry about cases matching. So if I accidentally wrote this as a lowercase a, if you wrap whatever your comparison value is up at the top in lower or upper, if you would prefer, then you can know that what you're typing in for what to compare it against is going to match, at least on that front.
Yeah.
And then trim. If you want to be really, really careful, you'd wrap whatever it is in whatever tricks you're doing, and then wrap the whole thing in trim, so that whether you've added an extra space or not to your comparison values. And then having it in trim, make sure that whatever you're comparing it against also doesn't have that extra space at the end.
Very true.
Very,
and also on the one of the cool things, it's been a year or two that they added the formatting, so you can actually like format it like a drop down of these values. But that becomes tricky if you're dependent on those and you like get the wrong one and it goes to the default state, and then I've had it mess up automations because the spelling wasn't the same as what the output was.
The format formula as drop downs and checkboxes I use all the time. I think they're one of my favorite little adjustments in recent Airtable history. They're not as relevant for this workflow here. I don't know if I've used that anywhere in this space, but they're so helpful. But you do kind of run into that same sort of, it's not a trap, but the same sort of potential outcome of, if your thing doesn't match, Airtable's not going to do what you would hope it does.
I had the funniest, or it ended up being a funny situation. I was banging my head against the wall for a while over it, involving those single select formatted formula fields. I was trying to update the formula, so I had duplicated the field, redid the formula, saved it. And then what I always do is I do a comparison formula. So I do a new field and say, if this one does not equal this one, like throw a value, and I compare them to make sure I look at the records that are about to change and make sure I agree. Yes, those are the ones that should be changing values. So all of them had the X. They all were like, these are all different. But I was like looking at them and I'm like, they all look exactly the same to me. Like I was like staring at it for probably a couple days. Like I kept coming back to it, being like, it's the same thing. Like it's literally the same thing. finally figured out. I had set the default value to one of the values on the list, and it had the shrug emoji in it, like somebody being like, hmm. And in my new formula, when I had typed the shrug emoji, I chose the little brown, it had black hair, the little figure. But in the other formula, it had blonde hair. And the default was set to the one with blonde hair. And I was like, literally, it was just the different color hair emoji.
Wow.
Be very careful with the people ones because there's so many variations and hard to even tell which one it is. So long story, but I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, oh my God.
Funny.
It's relevant if they don't match.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Also, Kamille, this is such a creative solution. Like I love having how you did the thing with the weekdays all out the 2 weeks in a row. That helper field, like that just gave me a bunch of ideas too. Like I once upon a time, like one of the very first projects I ever did, somebody asked me if I could write a formula to figure out how many Fridays fell in between two dates, which I don't know. Like, so I went to the forum, someone gave me a formula and I thought it worked, but years later I revisited it and I was like, this does not work. But I wonder if you could do something using this technique.
You probably can. It's like you have. It sounds like a simple question, but it's tougher than it sounds because first you need to figure out how many weeks are between the two dates that you have, and then you have to figure out, well, what is the weekday of both the start and the end, and that will tell you if the start date is a Saturday, for example, that's one fewer Friday that could be between those two dates. And if the end date is a Thursday, that's another fewer Fridays that could be between those two dates. So that's why the weekday of the start and end are important to know. But if you start on a Thursday and end on a Saturday, that's 2 extra Fridays that are between those dates. So you have to first figure out that, and then you figure out how many weeks are between the start and the end date, and then you just subtract somewhere between 0 and 4. So it's like you have to answer a couple of questions before you can answer that question. And this workaround, I thought of, it wasn't the first thing I thought of, it was like the second thing I thought of. And I was like, no, I don't have to resort to that. I'll figure it out. And then I spent another maybe hour and a half really digging through that other formula and trying to think through every possible, like edge case. And then I was like, well, unfortunately, this solves all of them. It's like you're never going to have more than 2 weeks at a time that you need to take into account for what my formula is trying to do. And this formula is just me typing this twice. So it feels so silly. And again, the reason why this is a separate formula is so that I don't have to type that string 7 times in that other formula. I can just refer to it multiple times and it keeps the other formulas shorter.
I love it. It's like simple, brilliant.
Yeah. I wouldn't have come up with that idea.
Yeah.
It took a while. But that's the explanation of how all of the formulas work. The last bit is the automation piece. So there's 2 automations and that's it for this space. Let me collapse things down a little bit. If I go back to the interface really quick, that button in the top right triggers the first automation, which creates the next set of tasks. So the reason why I did it this way is, again, I was trying to avoid a script. If I had a script in here, I could make it do 30 new tasks at a time, 50, 100. But because I'm not using a script, you have to have separate create record steps for each new task that you're trying to create. And there is a workaround that I was considering and ended up not doing to make this more than 5 in a way that's not annoying to do. And I'll talk about that later. But broadly, what this is doing is that button on that interface checks a checkbox. And whenever that checkbox is checked, this automation will run. So there's a simple condition at the top. In order to create the next task, I need to know when the next due date is, which was the result of all of those formulas we just went over. So take that next due date and create a new record where the due date is that date. And then I didn't show it, but there's I call the field an auto number. It's not, it's a number field that I'm auto incrementing by just taking whatever the max number is and adding 1. That way each task has their own auto number that they don't run, all together. This task can have 1 through 10 and the other task can have 1 through 10. So the first one is simple. And the second one, while this looks pretty similar, it is doing something similar, except it's not reading from the trigger anymore. It's reading from the previous output. So these are created in a defined sequence where first it's going to create this record and then it's going to create this record. And that allows me to say the due date of this second task should be based on the first task that I created. The formulas that we went over already are going to calculate again because the roll-up field would have updated itself, and then all of the formulas I talked about are going to do their calculation and figure out what the now next due date is. And I'm bringing that in as a roll-up. So after this first task is created, the roll-up gets updated and I can bring that in. And same thing with the next auto number. So this task is now reading from the second task that's created. Now that the second task is created, the due date updated again. So pull that in, and that's what the next due date is. So I could have kept going. The limit of steps, I think, is 25 for an automation. So I could do 25 minus 2 because of these 2 other steps that I needed to do. I didn't want to, so I stopped at 5. And then at the end of it all, I'm just clearing that checkbox. And this other condition, if I don't have a next due date that's after today, it's doing the same thing of clearing the checkbox. If I can't calculate the next due date, don't even bother. Don't create new tasks. There's something wrong. So that's what this automation is doing. The potential workaround I was considering was if on the interface I had somewhere where you could put in a number field of create this many tasks, I could have the automation create just one task and then decrement that number that you entered. If you put in 10, decrement that number by 1. So it puts in 9. But then I was having an issue where I could have the automation be triggered whenever that number field is updated, create a new task. And I just didn't want it to run one extra time because it's going to get down to updating the number field to 0. And then it would run again because it was just updated. And I just felt that would be sloppy. I could do it. There's no real reason not to do it. And that does make it more flexible, but it would chew through your automation runs like crazy. So just something to consider.
This is where I think last week we talked about, like, man, if they could just have a conditional, a loop that was sequential, then you could do this in an easy loop where you just, say, just set up a loop of 5 or however many you want to run. Then you wouldn't have to, you would just have one create record inside of a loop.
I went through the whole motion of creating a multi-select field that was like, it was multi-select and the values of each of them were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I would loop through. If you chose 4, you would have to choose 1, 2, 3, 4, and it would loop through each of those and create these 5 records at a time. But I wouldn't be able to know when the first loop finished or even when the first loop started. So you have to structure it so one loop ends definitively and then you start the next loop, which you can't do really in the loop setup that Airtable has natively. You kind of have to create your own loop. And then that's when I was like, let's just do 5 at a time.
Yeah.
So frustrating. Like sometimes I'll have like a second, like a count field and like, a roll up to be like how many of these records that are linked to this record have been processed by the loop so I can know when all of them have been. But like that's not reliable because that doesn't mean like if one of them failed, like I still want to know that the loop is over, and I would never know in that case.
Yeah.
Someday, maybe.
The last thing, and I'll go through this part really quickly, is the notion of streaks. So let's look at the data structure really quickly. Each of these tasks, which are repeated elements of that first table with all the crazy formulas, can be linked to a streak. And then there's a status. And then this is just to help you know, or help the automation know rather, if we're on like the 5th instance, for example, we want to check if the previous instance has completed. So in this case, the previous instance was 4. It was completed. So if I do the 5th one on time, I'm continuing that streak. But if the 4th one wasn't completed on time, then this should be its own new streak. And then the streaks table, I'm linking to the overall record as the individual tasks that are relevant for this streak. And then a couple helper fields to give it a name that sort of matters. So the first streak was from instance 1 through 2, and then I messed up 1 month, and now it's just we're on the 4th one, and let's see if we do the 5th one in time. So the way that automation is running of whenever a task is complete, we get the previous task using that previous calculation, which is just what's this number minus 1, and making sure that it's part of the same habit. And if there is a matching record, well, then we want to attach this task that just completed to the same streak as the previous one. If not, we want to create a brand new streak that is linked to whatever task just got completed. So this one actually relatively straightforward. And I know it's a little early for this one, but if I were to go in for January and mark this as complete, what that should do is update the streak. So I'm currently 2 instances in a row. And then if I go back and look at my data, check mail, instances 4 through 5. Just checking it from the other end. Yep. January 31st, which is the one that I just updated, was attached to the same streak as the previous record.
Very cool. Maybe I'd love to look at the interface. Let's talk a little bit about building out the interface.
Sure.
Okay, so what kind of page format are we using here?
This is the record review. The actual overall page that I used I didn't put too much thought into it. I think I had that old app I was using in mind where you could kind of easily switch back and forth between the different chores or habits that you were tracking. And record review is kind of the only modern one that lets you see the detail page pretty easily with whatever list you're looking at without taking up too much space. So if I get out of preview mode, the detail page takes up the majority of the screen real estate. And then I'm doing this on the team plan, which means I don't have conditional visibility available, but everyone does, the ability to have collapsible sections. So I took all of the settings fields and put them together up at the top. So if I don't need to edit my settings, which you rarely do after you set up your habit, you can just hide them away. So they're not completely hidden, but they don't take up too much space. The next section was about the streaks, which are pretty simple, of just 2 numbers up at the top, which have some, like they're looking at the same field, except for this one has a condition. Is current streak being true or not? And then this has all of the streaks formatted as a chart. This one, I don't know how useful this would be in practicality, but it's every streak that's relevant for this habit with the day that streak started and how many times in a row it happened. So would this be useful? I don't know, but I added it in because I thought it'd be a nice visual. And the last bit is put every task on a calendar. There's only one due date, so this one was fairly straightforward. And I have coloring on by status. So it just takes the color of that status field.
Cool.
Love it.
Awesome. This is great. Hopefully you all enjoy this new format. We go much deeper than we have in the past, talking about some real world use cases and some tips and tricks that hopefully help you all out in your Airtable building. And we'll do it again next week as well. We'll do another demo. And so if you have not joined our community, join us. BuiltOnAir.com/join gets you into an amazing community of Airtable users talking daily about Airtable. And we are also looking for guests to come on and showcase what you've built as well, even as early as in 2 weeks. So if you would like to reach out to me, you can DM me in the community. I'll post also a link to the sign up form as well and get some guests on. So that is today's show, and we will see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to check out our sponsor, OntoAir Backups, automated backups for Airtable. We'll see you next time on the Built on Air podcast.